Welcome to you all, and I'm very happy to be here. This is part of our celebration of the Ignatian Festival. The festival is something we began a number of years ago, and we do this every year. Sometimes it's a month-long celebration, sometimes it's a year-long celebration, but we kick it off around July, which is the Ignatian month. We're happy to be with Father Jim Martin, James Martin. I think he needs no introduction. I understand he was born in the year 1960. That was a good year, I think, because that was also the year I was born. The Philippine province and the New York province share a wonderful bond. Before we became a province, we were taken care of by the New York Jesuits. So those of us here in the Philippines, you may have met some of our New York province Jesuits. Anyhow, I just wanted to welcome you all to our festival and to welcome Father Jim. I think, we've read his books, so we sort of know who he is. He is a Jesuit, so please, take him with a grain of salt. You know the Jesuits. I think you've known us. So. But anyway, I'm really happy, Jim. Thank you. Thank you for wasting time with us today.
I want to thank Miriam for setting this all up. She did such a wonderful job. And Father Villaren for welcoming me, my Jesuit brother. I want to say, as Father was saying, that there is a very close bond between Jesuits in New York, in the New York area, and in the former New York province, the former region. Whereas Father was saying, Jesuits would be sent for many years to the Philippines. And in fact, I live with two Jesuits, Father Joe Parks and Father Roger Haight, who worked in the Philippines. And so I hear stories about the Ateneo all the time. And I'm very happy to be invited to, not only with the Jesuits, but with all of our colleagues here at such a prestigious school, and really just such a prestigious phenomenon. The Ateneo is such a phenomenon that I was saying to Miriam and Father, oftentimes people will come up to me in New York or at talks and say, I went to the Ateneo, and I'll say, of course I know the Ateneo. So it's a real honor for me to be here tonight. And I also want to thank you all, for allowing me to come into your homes and talk a little bit about Ignatian tools at this point in history. So what I wanted to talk about, what we'll do tonight is I'll talk for about, roughly a half an hour, and then we'll have a conversation, and then you can ask questions. So we all know, obviously, everybody, one of the reasons we're doing this via Zoom is because of COVID-19 and because of the terrible pandemic that has really, convulsed the world in a way that, I don't think any of us in our lifetimes, unless we were around for the Spanish flu, and I don't see any people that quite that old on the Zoom call. And this is something that has gone around the world. And it's something in a sense that that both separates us because we're so, none of us are with one another tonight. We're all quarantined. And it also unites us. There was a poster going around New York City where I live that said alone together, right? We're alone together. And so what I wanted to do tonight is to talk a little bit about some of the feelings and experiences that people have at this point in our history. And I think there are some common themes. And then look at 3 Ignatian tools, very simple Ignatian tools to help us confront those things, okay? Now I want to name some of the emotions that people have felt over the last couple of months. Probably the most common is fear, right? Fear of getting sick, fear of, possibly losing your job, fear of family members getting sick, fear of certain institutions and certain places closing, right? I think confusion is another. I think it's really important to name these things. Confusion about what to do, particularly at the beginning, how even to care for yourself and to care for your family and your friends. And should I go to work? Should I not go to work? Should I take public transportation? Should I not take public transportation? Even something as simple as Should I wear a mask, right? And I mean, some of these things have been answered, but there's still a lot of confusion and uncertainty. Uh, I think anger, there's some anger out there. A lot of people feel, why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to my family? Particularly people that have been hit with COVID virus or may have lost their jobs, their livelihood, or have been really inconvenienced by this, or just feel lonely. I would imagine a lot of people out there feelings of loneliness. I was just talking to my mother tonight. She's in a retirement community. She's 88, and she's not able to see as many people. And then also sadness, just this sadness of loss and death, and seeing these stories on TV and online about people dying. And so there are all these things that we're dealing with. And I think the question is, how can Ignatian spirituality help us with this? And I want to look at three tools: discernment of spirits, the examination of conscience, and Ignatian contemplation, imaginative prayer. Now, to begin with, and I'm happy that we showed that video. I think that Ignacio film is certainly the best film I've seen on Ignatius. And to begin with, I just want to give you a brief overview, very brief, since I know most of you know it, of the life of St. Ignatius Loyola. And we've seen some of those images. So, as you know from those, well, you may not know, but he was born in 1491 in the Basque region of Spain. And as you know from that little clip, he was a soldier and a knight. And early on in his career, he was very much into sort of impressing other people and making a name for himself and being successful. And one of the things I like about that movie is one of the things he mentions in his autobiography is he was very vain about his hair. He had very nice hair. And the actor in that movie has very nice hair too. So I always think about that when I see the movie. So he was very, he wanted to make a name for himself. During a battle in Pamplona, Spain in 1521, as you saw, you might be able to figure that out from the clips, he was injured in a battle. His leg was injured. And he was brought to his family castle. And this is where the discernment of spirits starts. As you saw in that clip, he's given books to read. He's given 2 books. Now, he wanted to read books about knights and adventures and those kinds of things, but instead he was given, to his chagrin and to his frustration, let me close my desk. Sorry, there's my desk there. He was given books on the life of Christ and also books on the lives of the saints, which he read. As he was reading, he found something interesting happening. He found that he was, still really interested in impressing, as he said, a certain woman, right, and making a name for himself. But when he read about the lives of the saints, something happened. And when he read about the life of Jesus, something happened to him. And he said to himself, I started to think, what would happen if I did this that Francis did, St. Francis of Assisi did, or that St. Dominic did? Okay, so maybe I could be like Francis and Dominic. Now, Jesuits always laugh that, here's someone who wasn't the most religious person who's already thinking he can be, like one of the great saints. But, God can use even our vanity, right, and our kind of desire to get ahead for God's purposes. But there was a difference. He says this in his autobiography. There's a difference between the feelings that he had afterwards. So initially, when he would think about impressing this woman and impressing other people and making a name for himself, he was initially excited, but then he would feel a little empty afterwards. When he thought about following the example of the lives of the saints, specifically Francis and Dominic, those are the 2 that he mentioned, he was excited, and then the feelings would continue. Feelings would continue. And a famous passage in the autobiography, he says, little by little, I started to realize that this was one way that God was teaching me, that God was speaking to me. And that's the beginning of discernment of spirits. And that's the first tool that I want to talk about. All right. So discernment of spirits in Ignatius's life was the kind of realization that not only does God want us to make good and life-giving decisions, okay, which I think all of us would appreciate, and I think pretty much any believer would say, if you said to a believer, a Christian, or a Catholic, do you think God wants you to make good decisions? That person would say, yes, of course God wants that for me. But Ignatius's insight, or at least not just his insight, but the insight that he really found helpful, was that not only would God want you to make good decisions, but God is going to help you make good decisions. All right, and through your inner life, right, through he called them spirits, but through kind of discerning and trying to understand those spirits that are those sort of voices that happen within you, right, that God was leading him to make a good decision. All right, and so this is the beginning of Ignatian spirituality. So what does he do? So he leaves his old life behind, and he decides he's going to become, he's going to become a pilgrim. He's going to go to the Holy Land. He changes his life utterly. He makes a pilgrimage to the monastery of Montserrat. We saw him in front of the statue of the Black Madonna there, and he starts. All right. Now I'm not going to give you the whole history of the Society of Jesus. You can read that in another book. But I want to focus on this question of discernment of spirits. All right. So how can we use that? How can we use discernment of spirits during the COVID-19 crisis, during the coronavirus? Okay. Well, one of the most important things to look at is understanding how God is moving us in these situations. How is God calling to us and inviting us to make good decisions, even in these times of, as we said before, fear, anger, confusion, sadness, frustration. All right. Well, Ignatius gives us the tools, basically. And in Ignatian spirituality, we look at what the good spirit does and what the evil spirit does. Now, look, we don't have to, Ignatian spirituality is framed in terms of good spirit and evil spirit. All right. And depending on your idea of Satan and the evil spirit, okay, you don't have to think of Satan as actually with, horns and hooves, but it is a presence, right? The evil spirit is a presence. And I think on a very simple level, we can all experience that within ourselves, right? I mean, don't we all have these experiences of feeling pulled towards doing good and doing bad, right? Towards doing something selfish and something that's more altruistic. So, and Ignatius's insight, one of his many, was that he realized that you could identify the good spirit by certain characteristics. All right. So, in the case of a person that's trying to live a moral life, that's trying to go from good to better. Now, I think everyone on this Zoom call is probably trying to live a moral life, so we'll focus on that. Ignatius says that the good spirit acts in a certain way. The good spirit builds us up, gives us confidence, consoles us, gives us hope, all right? Calms us down. That's what the good spirit does. So if you're trying to do a good thing, the good spirit will say, keep going. You're doing great. Don't worry. Have hope. And these are not only voices that come from within us, these are even voices from outside of us, meaning a friend could say, don't worry, you're doing great. All right? Things will be okay. Keep going. Okay? Don't get upset. Let's look at this in terms of, say, if you were dealing with coronavirus, the good spirit inside of you would say, trust your doctors. Keep at it, right? Be patient. That's the good spirit. It's very gentle. St. Ignatius said that it was like a drop of water on a sponge. Isn't that a great metaphor? Gentle, soft. The bad spirit, the spirit that pulls us away from God, is the opposite. It disturbs us. It makes us panic. Okay? It sets up, as Ignatius says, false obstacles. It causes in this one of the greatest expressions he ever wrote, gnawing anxiety, just this sense of just, oh my gosh, everything's terrible. In a word, the good spirit leads to hope. The bad spirit leads to despair. Okay? And so now, when you're going in the opposite direction, St. Ignatius says it works in the opposite way, right? If you're a bad person, the good spirit's going to try to wake you up. It's going to be very strong. It's like the voice of your conscience saying, oh my God, what am I doing? The bad spirit, if you're going to worse, will say, oh, keep doing it, keep doing that bad thing. But we're going to focus on people that are trying to live a moral life. In general, the good spirit gives us calm, makes us consoled, helps us to relax, all right? Now, what does this have to do with COVID-19? Well, a lot, because, the spirit that makes us think, oh my gosh, I'll never be able to get through this. That is not the good spirit. And that's one of my first lessons. One of the first tools that we can get from Ignatian discernment is that the voice of God in this pandemic is the voice of calm. It's the voice of being reasonable. It's the voice of consolation, or it's the voice of encouragement. It's the voice of inspiration. The voice that is not coming from God, and this is, I'm sure all of you have experienced this, is that panic. Because Ignatius says, in the case of the evil spirit working on the good person, the evil spirit will be like the drop of water on a stone. Boom, very hard, violent almost. Okay? And so when we are discerning the spirits, the question is, can we, in the midst of this coronavirus, look to these tools and say that this is the way God is working within me? All right, so let's take an example. Let's say that you are going in, I'm going to make something up. You're going in for a test to the doctors, okay? And you are walking over and you're going to your doctors and you're masked up and maybe you feel like you have the virus, and you go in and there's two voices within you. One voice says, oh boy, it's a good idea that you're going to the doctor to get tested. That is a very smart thing to do, right? It's very wise and good for you for doing that. And you have a good doctor and you should be at peace. That sounds very calm. That's a drop of water on the sponge. If you're walking over to the doctor's appointment, you're saying, oh my gosh, what if someone is in the office, coughs on me? I mean, do you see that the difference? That's very violent, right? It disturbs your calm. It shakes you up. Someone once described it as if you're kind of going down a river in a boat and you hit a rock. Okay, that's what the evil spirit feels like. That kind of catch in you. So those are the voices to listen to within you and also outside of you. I mean, Ignatius, we don't talk about this as much in Jesuit spirituality, but if you have a friend that helps you, and this is, by the way, this is not to say that you're not using your intellect and you're not being reasonable, right? You're not taking precautions. I mean, the good spirit is not going to say, oh, don't worry about anything, right? I mean, you need to take precautions and use your intellect. This is sort of the interior disposition that you have. If you have someone from the outside, a friend of you says, oh my gosh, we'll never get through this. You say that, look, that voice is not coming from the good spirit. That doesn't mean your friend is evil, right? It just means that's not a voice to listen to, okay? So I would say, I've been saying this to individuals and to people who come to me for spiritual direction, that to boil it down in this time of coronavirus, the good spirit is the spirit of hope, and the evil spirit is the spirit of despair. And that, if you want it sort of boiled down. So when you're trying to make decisions, right? When you're trying to determine which voice to listen to, how to sort of proceed, even just sort of walking around during the day, don't listen to that voice. Don't listen to the voice that is the voice of despair. It might be running through your head. You might see it on TV or online. You might hear it from friends. It doesn't deserve your assent. And Ignatius says the more you sort of pay attention to the voice of God in your life, the more you'll understand it. All right. It's like the parable of Jesus talking about the sheep know the shepherd's voice. I worked in East Africa for a couple of years, and there were a lot of sheep in Nairobi. And one time in the office that I was working in at the Jesuit Refugee Service, this herd of sheep started to graze on our lawn. And I'd never seen a flock of sheep that close before. And the shepherd just said one word. The word was "come" in Swahili, and they all looked up. And I thought, the sheep know the shepherd's voice. So they had paid attention to that voice. So gradually over time, the more you listen to that voice, the more you sort of are attentive to it in your life, the more you'll be able to recognize it. And the point is, just like in Ignatius's life, all right, where God was helping him make good decisions by listening to that voice, all right, God will help you make good decisions by giving you that sense of of calm, of consolation, of encouragement. So listen to that voice, because that's God's spirit within you, and God wants the best for you. The question is, which voice should we listen to? Well, choose life, as they say in the Old Testament, right? Listen to the voice of God who wants the best for you. So that's the first tool we look at, the discernment of spirits, which is based on Ignatius's own experience, and also Ignatius's experience of directing other people through their spiritual lives. Okay. The second tool is probably a very familiar one to you, and I'm going to put a little bit of a twist on it, and it's the examination of conscience. And the examination of conscience is a tool. It wasn't invented by Ignatius. The old joke is, the Jesuits act like we invented all these things, prayer and, the examining your conscience and those kinds of things. And, there were always examinations of conscience before. The Greek philosophers had it, the Stoics had it. But I think in Christian terms, or at least in Christian spiritual history, they were more about kind of looking at your own sinfulness. So I think many people on the Zoom call, might think of examination of conscience as something you do before you go to confession, right? I'm going to examine my conscience. But in Ignatius's worldview, the examination of conscience, or the examen, it's spelled E-X-A-M-E-N, from the Spanish, it's examen, right? It sounds like examine. Is really a review of your day. Now, I'm going to go over it, at least the way I like to do it, and I like to teach it to people. And then I'm going to relate it to the coronavirus. So the examination of conscience basically has 5 steps. Now, you talk to 10 different Jesuits, you'll get 10 different examens. You might get 11 different examens if you talk to the right Jesuits. I see Father laughing. He knows what I'm talking about. Most of them have these steps. So the first step, and just to make it realistic and concretize it, this prayer takes about 10 to 15 minutes a day, okay? And usually people do it every night, before they go to bed. You don't have to, but most people do it every night. So it's a very simple prayer. And I'll go through it pretty quickly because I think most people on the Zoom call already know it. But to refresh you, the first step is putting yourself in the presence of God. All right, so it's inviting God into your prayer. Now, why do we do that? Well, just so the prayer is not a monologue. Okay, so it's not just us sitting down and kind of running through things in our day. And there are many ways of doing that. A simple way. The way I do it is just ask God, be with me. Just God, be with me now. Or just be intentional about knowing that you're in God's presence. One of the ways that Ignatius said to do it was to actually stand up and look at the place that you're going to be praying. Okay, so I would stand up, and if I were praying in that chair behind me, that's my desk chair, I would actually look at it for about a minute and imagine God looking at you. And then when you sit down in that chair, it just has a different feel, right? So the first step is to place yourself in the presence of God. The next step in the examen is to call to mind things that you're grateful for. Okay, now Ignatius started with gratitude. The examen begins with gratitude. Why is that? Well, one reason is because most of us, I would think most people on this Zoom call like to get things done, right? Here you are, spending your time, learning something, right? Hopefully learning something from me. We tend to be problem solvers, and we tend to go to the negative very fast. Like, okay, how was your day? Oh my gosh, my day was crazy. I had all these things to do. I had to do this and this and this. And we're all problem solvers, and we all sort of notice the problems first. I was talking to a psychologist recently. I'm doing a book on prayer, and I was talking to a psychologist who said, this is a carryover from our days as cavemen and cavewomen, right? In prehistoric times, yeah. I see Miriam wondering about that. In prehistoric times, the person who was attentive to danger, right, who could see danger, like a saber-toothed tiger or some animal, right, would be the one that would survive. The man or woman who is contemplative and looking at the stars, in prehistoric times would get eaten probably. So we developed in our minds this kind of habit of always looking for danger, right, to protect ourselves. Now, that works great when you're a caveman or a cavewoman, right? In prehistoric times, it doesn't work so good now because it sort of moves us into just problem solving and worries and fear. So Ignatius wants to ground you in gratitude first. You know, it's not simply an overall spiritual practice, but it's a spiritual practice in the examination of conscience. Ignatius Loyola once said that the ingratitude was the worst, the most abominable sin, and the origin of all sins. That's how much he did not like ungrateful people and ingratitude. So we start with gratitude. What does that mean? It means calling to mind the things that you're grateful for during the day. Something big, you know, you got a wonderful bit of news from someone. You know, someone that you thought was sick with coronavirus is actually okay, right? You were able to meet someone through social distancing that you hadn't seen for weeks and weeks, and it was really nice. I'll tell you a nice story. My mother, as I said, who's 88, she had a doctor's appointment, and my sister went down to see her, and she hadn't seen her for months, and she put a poncho on and a hat and a mask and gave her a hug. And my mom loved that. You know, a very socially distant, sanitary, hygienic hug. So, you know, that's something you can be grateful for. So big things like that, but also small things. You know, small things like you had a good breakfast. The sun came out after rainy day. It was cool. You saw a beautiful flower and smelled the flower. Your cat or dog did something funny, right? So you call those things to mind. You savor them as you would savor anything, and then you thank God for them. Right? So you really spend time in gratitude. The next step of the examination of conscience is the review of the day. And this is really the bulk of the examination of conscience. And simply put, you see where you encountered God during the day, from the moment you got up to the moment you went to bed. All right, now for a lot of people, this is in interactions, but not everybody. I mean, you know, maybe you went to a, you know, you sang some song, you saw some online song, you know, like from the song we just saw from Father, one of the Jesuits who wrote the song for that prayer, you know, that you think that's really beautiful. That may be something you saw in the morning. You got something at work done. You got a nice phone call from someone. So you move through the day, right? Morning, noon, night, and you try to see where God was. And, you know, it's often easier to see where God was than to see where God is. Okay, you know that example of Moses asking God to see God's face, and God says, "You can't see my face, but you will see me pass." Right? There's a sense of being able to see God better in the past. And so you look at your day and you see where God was present. All right. And then the next step, the fourth step, is sorrow. Okay, so none of us are perfect, right? None of us are sinless. You know, I don't see Jesus on the Zoom call or the Blessed Mother, right? We're all imperfect. And so can you look at things that you regret? If they're sinful, you might decide that you need to go to confession, right? But it's a way of kind of doing a moral inventory. And then finally, at the end of the exam, you ask for the grace to see God in the next day. All right, now, so most of us know the examen. What does that have to do with the time that we're in right now? Well, just this. In these difficult times, you know, when so many of us are focused on danger and illness and economic worries and really in political instability, and here in the United States, racial injustices, that's a big topic here in the United States these days, it can be very difficult to see where God is. All right, because we sometimes only look at, legitimately, it's important to confront these problems, obviously, you know, illness and racism and economic woes and things like that, right? But oftentimes we are prevented, because of our human nature, from looking at where God is in our lives and where God is helping us. And one of the things I like to suggest with people who are going through difficult times, okay, and also in this time of coronavirus, is to spend a little more time on the examination of conscience, and particularly on the gratitude section of it. All right. Oftentimes when people are depressed, you know, or going through difficult times, it's very hard for them to see, happy moments and joyful moments. Let me turn off my Slack for a second. happy moments and joyful moments and moments where God is present. Our human nature is to say, if we've had a difficult day, nothing went right. You know, where was God? Nowhere, right? God was nowhere to be found. I had a terrible day. And it's only in the examination of conscience and only in the gratitude part, often, sometimes in the review part, that with God's help and God's grace, because remember, God's helping you with the examen. It's not just you kind of going through a list. God's going to raise things up and remind you. And I find this, look, over and over and over again. If I've had a bad day, I will be, you know, like this, and I'll sit down and I'll say, what a terrible day. And something will come up to remind me of God's presence in my life. Okay, so the examination of conscience, particularly in difficult circumstances, which everyone is going through. I mean, I don't think there's anyone in the world that's untouched by this, truly. Which everyone is going through, is an essential tool, right? And I would say it's even more important now than it is in normal times. And what I would also encourage people to do is sometimes spend more time on the gratitude part than they would normally do. Okay, so and sometimes, you know, when people are really struggling, to spend, you know, almost all the time on the gratitude part. Now, I want to put this into perspective. That doesn't mean that you pretend that you don't have these negative experiences or negative emotions, right? That doesn't mean that you say, well, I'm gonna suppress all these emotions of anger and sadness and frustration and confusion and fear. Not at all. But it's to allow those things to exist in the larger world, you know, of God's grace. And I'll tell you something my spiritual director told me years ago. I was going through a difficult time, and I forget what it was about. And I just told him how angry I was at God and how much I was telling God that I was, you know, so frustrated and so angry. And he said, well, are you being honest in your prayer? And I said, well, of course, I told you I'm telling God how angry I am. And he said, well, what about all the other things that are going on in your life? Can you tell me some other things that are going on in your life right now? And I named a few good things. And he said, are you talking to God about that too? I said, no, not really. And he said, well, then you're not being honest, are you? You're only showing God, you're only talking to God about part of the reality of your life. Okay? And so the examination of conscience helps us to see the whole picture. You know, and oftentimes, you know, in these difficult situations, in the middle of a pandemic, it's ways that we don't anticipate. It might be a friend just texting us, someone we haven't heard from for a long time. All right. It may be an insight that we have. It may be something as simple as a feeling of calm that we have. All right. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I just want to say that the examination of conscience in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic is essential, and particularly the gratitude part. So I would say if you're not doing the examen, to try to make that a practice. You know, it will really jumpstart your spiritual life. And if you are doing the examination and you still feel that it's difficult, try to focus more on the gratitude. Okay. So that's the second tool. So the first tool is discernment of spirits. The second tool is the examination of conscience. And the third tool I want to talk about is, and these are all familiar tools, they're just given a twist for the pandemic. The third tool I want to talk about is Ignatian contemplation. All right, so Ignatian contemplation or imaginative prayer. This is the way that Jesuits like to pray. Again, Ignatius did not invent this, right? I mean, it's using your imagination to enter into a scripture scene, okay? And I'm going to talk about why this is important in the midst of this pandemic. But let me talk a little bit about Ignatian contemplation. So simply put, it's using your imagination to imagine yourself either speaking with Jesus or Mary or one of the saints or one of the apostles, or more frequently and more generally, placing yourself in a scripture scene. Okay? So I'd like to take a scripture scene, and one of the reasons I'm using it is because it was the reading from yesterday, so it's very topical. And it's also a reading that Pope Francis used when he did his beautiful prayer service in the midst of the pandemic about 2 months ago. It feels like 2 years ago, but I think it was only 2 months ago. It was a little bit before Easter. So this is a reading, so I'm going to read the gospel. It's very brief from yesterday, from the gospel according to Matthew. As Jesus got into a boat, his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a violent storm came up on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by waves, but he was asleep. They came and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." He said to them, "Why are you terrified, you of little faith?" Then he got up, rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. The disciples were amazed and said, "What sort of man is this, whom even the winds and the sea obey?" Okay, so a very familiar reading from the Gospel of Matthew. How would you use Ignatian contemplation to enter into that? Well, you use your imagination to, what Ignatius calls, compose the scene. Now, when I first heard about this kind of prayer, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, if not most of you, I thought that's ridiculous. I mean, I'm just like, what am I, just making things up in my mind? And I told my first spiritual director, that's ridiculous. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I said, that's Ignatian prayer? Just like make stuff up? And he said, now, Jim, do you think God could use, relationships and nature and your friends and the sacraments to speak to you? And I said, sure, of course. Do you think God can use the Bible to speak to you and church? And he named all these different things. I said, sure. And he said, well, why can't God use your imagination? So the imagination is a gift that God gives us, in a way to encounter God. And look, I mean, Jesus, I would often say that even Jesus used this. Because Jesus, when he's asked about, who is my neighbor, he says, well, a man went down to Jericho. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan. So he's inviting people to imagine themselves in these stories, right? And probably the first people who heard the Gospels, which would have been done orally, right? The Gospels were first orally transmitted, would have imagined, what it was like to see Jesus raise someone from the dead or Jesus still the storm. All right. So how do we do this in our own lives? All right. Well, part of it is giving ourselves some time, right, to enter into the scriptures, maybe a half an hour or so. And how would you do this meditation? Let's just use this meditation. So you would close your eyes and you would place yourself in the presence of God. And then you would ask yourself 5 questions. Now, you don't have to do it exactly this way. Some people do it all at once. What do I see? Okay, what does the boat look like? Am I looking at this from outside? Maybe I've seen some pictures of boats in Jesus's time. You don't have to be an historian or an archaeologist, but what does it look like? What do the disciples look like? What does Jesus look like? What's the storm look like? Try to imagine these things in your mind. Next, what do I hear? Well, it's a storm. It's pretty noisy. Is there lightning? What does the water sound like? Coming over the sideboards or whatever you call it on a boat. What do I smell? Well, you're in a fishing boat. How does that smell? Right? I mean, you're with people who they didn't bathe back in the 1st century, right? As frequently as we do. What does that smell like? Okay, what do I feel? What do I feel physically? Well, if I'm in a boat and it's raining, I'm probably cold and wet. Maybe that adds to your sense of panic. Okay, and what do I taste? Now, in some scripture passages, that's not going to matter very much, but if you're in the wedding feast of Cana, what does the wine taste like? If you're at the miracle of the loaves and the fishes, what does the fish taste like? So you compose the scene. You imagine what it looks like. And then you let it play out in your mind. And the key thing is you notice what comes up. Now, you allow yourself to notice what comes up in you. This passage, I think, is very helpful for us where we are, because so many of us would feel, for example, one thing that might come up is you start to say, yeah, why is Jesus asleep? Where is he? Where is he in my life? I can see why the disciples are angry. He's asleep in my life too. He's not doing anything. Where is Jesus? Okay, so you start to feel this, you're angry all of a sudden. Where does that come from? This is God kind of raising these things up for you so you can look at it. All right? And then can you speak about these things with Jesus or with God? Can you talk? Look, at the disciples are very blunt with him. It's interesting. In the Gospel of Mark, Mark comes first and then Matthew comes later. Mark is about AD 65. Matthew is about AD 85. In the Gospel of Mark, they say, don't you care we're dying? I mean, it's really blunt. Yeah, don't you care, Jesus? Matthew makes it a little softer. Matthew makes it into a prayer. Lord, save us. Right? So can you be honest with Jesus? If you experience this sense of anger, or if you experience sadness, I'm sad that Jesus feels absent from my life. I'm sad that it doesn't seem like Jesus is helping me. You know, God is raising these emotions up for a reason. Okay? God is raising these emotions up and these reactions up for a reason. So emotions can come up, or maybe an insight comes up. Maybe you have an insight. We tend in Ignatian spirituality, unfortunately, to privilege the emotional over the intellectual, which is funny for Jesuits. But maybe you have an insight. Maybe you say, you know what? You know, I do see God in my life. I do see signs of God. I do feel like Jesus is calming the storm. Or maybe you feel just a feeling. Maybe there's a feeling of calm that comes over you when you hear Jesus calm the storm. Or maybe you have a memory. You have a memory of a time where Jesus, you were upset and Jesus helped you through that. So all these things can come up: emotions, insights, memories, okay, feelings, right? Even words or phrases. You might hear someone say, "The Lord is my shepherd." That might come up, you know, in this passage. So all these things can come up. Now, what's the point of it in the midst of the coronavirus? It helps to be able to read readings like this one and to be able to speak to Jesus bluntly about how you feel. You know, there was a reason that Pope Francis used this very passage in his meditation. It's because it describes so well what we're experiencing. And I've been using this passage for people to help them understand, you know, what it's like to be. Look, the disciples had the same experience that you do. Help us, we're perishing. Help us, Lord. So can we be as honest with Jesus as the disciples were, but also can we listen to his response like the disciples did? All right. So Ignatian contemplation can help us imagine ourselves in a scene, and it enables us to speak to Jesus more easily. Now, in an even simpler way, we can look at what's called a colloquy, which is where you simply imagine yourself with Jesus, or with God, or with Mary. You know, one of the simplest ones is, you know, imagine a room where Jesus is, and walk into the room and sit down. What would you like to say to him? And imagine what he would say to you. Now, look, sometimes that's a challenge. I mean, and not every word that comes into your mind is from God or from Jesus. But a lot of times you can say, well, what would we think that Jesus would say? You know, and we know Jesus pretty well. You know, what can we imagine him saying? Or if you don't want to do it that way, you can just speak to him. And sometimes it's great to just get it off your chest and say, look, Jesus, I need to give you these concerns and these fears of mine. Sometimes I like to think of my fears and my concerns as a little ball, right? And I say, here, you take them. You know, you take them. I want you to have them. You deal with them. And knowing that Jesus has them and is taking care of them can give you a sense of peace. So in Ignatian contemplation, we are able to imagine ourselves in scenes that are often very vivid in the Gospels that fit our experiences, like the storm at sea, or more general scenes where we can imagine ourselves with Jesus and unburden ourselves of these emotions. All right? So God wants to meet us in all of these different ways in the midst of this pandemic, through the discernment of spirits, where he's going to help us make good decisions and calm us, through the examination of conscience, okay, where we're going to be invited to see where God is at work in our day, and through Ignatian contemplation, where we are able to enter into a place where we can speak to God about our emotions. So those are my three tools. They're very simple. They're not unfamiliar to you, but I wanted to give them a little bit of a spin during this Ignatian festival to help you use them in this environment that we're all going through right now.